Hey everyone, Mitits here.
In this series, I'll be going through the entire Diary of a Wimpy Kid franchise, looking through every single one of the books and various other parts of the series to see what makes Diary of a Wimpy Kid so special. Obviously, we're going to be starting with the very first book, 2007's Diary of a Wimpy Kid. So let's get right into this. Now, before we begin talking about the first book, I want to explain how this series is going to be structured. This is going to be a 4-part series where we will go through 4 eras of Diary of a Wimpy Kid. These eras are what I consider to be the Golden Era, the Silver Era, the Bronze Era, and the Modern Era. Now, we are going to structure this in a way that we will go through all the books in chronological order, but in between some of the books, we'll be talking about some other things. For example, we'll be mentioning Igdoof, the online version of Diary of a Wimpy Kid, the Wimpy Kid movies, and various other things. And there's going to be more stuff we're going to be doing during each segment where we talk about the books, and I will tell you about them when we get to them. Anyway, let's begin with the first book, Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Now, when it comes to how I'll be talking about these books, I'm not just going to be reading word for word what happens in them, because at that point, I'm not really doing anything. You might as well just read the books. Instead, I'm going to talk about the main characters, the plot, and also just a bunch of different things that happen in the book that interest me. So first of all, let's talk about the characters. First, I'm going to talk about the main cast, which consists of 6 characters: Greg, Rowley, Roderick, Manny, Susan, and Frank. First of all, we have Greg, the main character, and also the worst main character in the history of children's literature. And I'm not saying that Greg is a poorly written character, he's actually written insanely well. But what I mean by the worst is that he is the worst. He's selfish, he's lazy, he's manipulative. Everything he does in the entire series, he does to benefit himself. And for people who don't really know that much about Diary of a Wimpy Kid, you're probably thinking, wow, that sounds terrible. Why would anyone read this book? But the thing is that what makes Diary of a Wimpy Kid so great is the fact that Greg fails. Pretty much almost none of his schemes to actually become famous, which is what his main goal is, ever actually work. So what makes the story entertaining is just seeing Greg constantly failing due to either his plans to become famous being flawed or due to him being lazy and not seeing everything through properly. Next up, we have Rowley, who is Greg's best friend, and he's this nice, innocent kid, but that also means he's really gullible. And that's why he's friends with Greg, despite Greg's being such an awful person. And it's also how Rowley always ends up getting involved in Greg's schemes. Next up, we have Roderick, who's Greg's older brother, who constantly bullies him throughout the books. Roderick is a really interesting character, because on the surface, it looks like he's really dumb, but secretly, he's actually a genius. And what he does is that he pretends like he's incompetent so that he doesn't have to do nearly as much work. So Roderick is a really interesting character and is honestly the best character in the Wimpy Kid books. Next up, we have Manny, Greg and Roderick's younger brother. Manny is pretty much a brat who gets away with anything. There's pretty much never a single time that he actually gets in trouble for something in the books, and that's because he's only 3 years old. And Manny can pretty much get away with doing anything because his parents pretty much never punish him for doing anything. Next up, we have Greg's parents, Susan and Frank. Susan is pretty much a mom who really cares for her kids, but a lot of the times ends up embarrassing them while trying to help them. She's also really assertive, and pretty much in any arguments, she almost always wins. And lastly, out of the main cast, we have Frank Heffley. Frank is usually serious, and there's also a lot of moments where he jumps to conclusions before he knows the bigger picture. He's also constantly trying to get Greg and Roderick to be more active, despite it multiple times not working. While there are some cases where he isn't the greatest dad, he still does clearly care about his kids. Now, the Heffleys aren't the only recurring characters in this series. There are both a bunch of different characters that appear at Greg's school and also a bunch of characters from Greg's family. First, some of the characters that we commonly see in Greg's school are Fregley, who's known as the weird kid that no one likes talking to, and who constantly bothers Greg when Greg is on his way to Rowley's house. Next up, we have Patty, who's this smart kid who Greg has a big grudge against. Then you have Chirag, who's this more shorter kid who gets bullied very often, and we occasionally see Greg take part in the bullying also. Now, I'll say with these 3 characters, I feel like their roles are very minor, as they don't really appear a ton of times throughout the books. But I definitely feel like these characters get a lot more time in the movies, which unfortunately I can't say about this next character, Bryce Anderson, who's this popular kid at Greg's grade. He unfortunately doesn't get a lot of screen time in the movie compared to the other characters at Greg's school, so there really isn't a lot left about his character to talk about. And now, as of right now, some of the recurring characters in Greg's family are his Uncle Charlie and his grandma, who appear from time to time in the books. And also, it's probably important that I mention Rowley's parents also, because they appear quite a few times in the books. The most notable thing to mention is the fact that Frank doesn't really like Rowley because he feels that Rowley's going to end up messing something up. And it's the same case with Rowley's dad, who doesn't like Greg because he feels like Greg is a bad influence on Rowley, which he probably is. And now, there are two more characters I want to talk about because these are the main antagonists of the first book. First of all, you have this group of three teenagers who pretty much mess with Greg and Rowley on Halloween, and they come back into the story a lot later in. And then lastly, you have the cheese. And now I'm going to talk about the story behind this cheese a little bit later, but I just want to say, if you don't know about the cheese, just know you should be afraid. And now that we know about the main characters and some of the supporting cast in the first book, let's get into the main plot of the first Diary of a Wimpy Kid book.
The story of the first book follows Greg in his first day back in middle school trying to become the most popular person throughout the whole year. This involves various things such as running for school treasurer, joining the safety patrol, trying to get his comic published in the school newspaper, and various other things. A lot of these things Greg does start leading to his friendship with Rowley getting worse until one day when Greg wears Rowley's coat while on safety patrol, which leads to Rowley getting into trouble because people thought that Rowley did something which Greg did, and they end up no longer being friends. The entire story comes to a head when they end up getting into a fight at the school blacktop, and this is where the teenagers, which I mentioned earlier on, return. And they wonder what to do with Greg and Rowley, but then they see the cheese. And now, let me explain to you the cheese. If anyone touches the cheese, they will get this thing called the cheese touch, which would pretty much lead to the end of your social life in this school, as everyone would try to avoid you since you have the cheese touch. And the teenagers end up making Rowley eat the cheese. Then, the next day, people obviously realize that the cheese is missing. And before people can find out what happened, Greg says that he threw away the cheese, taking the blame from Rowley. So Greg and Rowley become friends again, the book leaves off on a happy ending, and that's the main story of the first Diary of a Wimpy Kid book. Now, before I go into detail about a bunch of things, I want to talk about my overall opinions about this book. One thing I want to mention is how the structuring of this book is really interesting because it feels more like a proper journal than like a regular book is structured. And the structuring of this book itself feels completely different from the rest of the Wimpy Kid books. And I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing for me. I feel like I'm kind of in the middle, but honestly, it does also just work well because this is the book where they have to introduce everyone. I'll say this though, this is easily one of the best books in the franchise. And also, I just love the ending because we see Greg, as self centered as he is, finally doing something that will help someone, even though it will harm his social status. And while at the end, we know that Greg isn't going to completely change, we do know at the minimum he's going a step in the right direction. And now, before we go into the next book, there are just a bunch of small little things that happen in this book that I just want to talk about so that you can get the real full experience of the first Diary of a Wimpy Kid book. First of all, I want to talk about this question a lot of people have had regarding Diary of a Wimpy Kid, and that is, what grade is Greg in the books? Now, for most people, this is an easy question to answer. Greg in the first book is in the 6th grade, and through the rest of the books, it goes from 7th to the 8th grade, and then eventually just turns into a mess nobody can figure out. But what if I told you in the first book, Greg is not supposed to be in the 6th grade, but rather the 7th grade? In the point of the book where they first talk about the cheese touch, they talk about it starting the year prior. And when Greg talks about the cheese touch, it is very clear that he's talking about it as if he was there experiencing it, which he couldn't have been if this is his first year in middle school. And And this has even more evidence backing it up later on in the book when Greg talks about one of his electives and he mentions that he was planning on signing up for Home Economics 2 because he was good at Home Economics 1, meaning Greg had to have done that in the 6th grade. And now it's pretty obvious to the majority of people where the confusion comes from. This is because in the movies, they take a very different approach by having Greg starting off in the 6th grade. But yeah, it is very clear that in the books, Greg is supposed to be in the 7th. Also, this is one thing I really want to mention. I just love the continuity in these really early Diary of a Wimpy Kid books because it feels like every single small event that happens in the book eventually comes back around later on. And now, there is a reason for that, which I will be explaining later on in the video, but I just want to say how it's really cool how everything fits with each other. Also, this is just a really small thing. On page 92, I can't really tell, but it almost seems like there's a different font that we don't see again in the books. This is one point in the book where Greg's trying to get into exercising, and he has Rowley using this makeshift dumbbell. And as Rowley's having trouble breathing, since Greg won't take the barbell off of him because Greg thinks Rowley's just slacking, you see with like Rowley's struggling to breathe, it almost looks like it's a different font. I have no idea if it actually is, or maybe it's just like bolded or whatever, but that just seems like something interesting. Also, this is another thing which quite a few people know because there's a whole video made on it, but the first Diary of a Wimpy Kid book, and only the first book, actually fits absolutely perfectly into the 2007 to 2008 calendar. There's a whole video on it. I am probably showing it on screen right here right now. Once this video is done, I definitely recommend you go check it out since it's a very cool video and it just delivers really interesting information. Now, here's another thing a lot of people have a question about, and that is who made Zooey Mama? Because it gets kind of confusing with the different Diary of a Wimpy Kid adaptations that do different things, which show either Greg or Rowley being the original creator of Zooey Mama. For example, in the live action movies, Rowley makes Zooey Mama out on his own, but then in the animated movies, Greg makes Zooey Mama and Rowley steals it without Greg's permission. But what happens in the book is really interesting. In the original book, Greg creates Zooey Mama and him and Rowley both work on it. But eventually, Greg gets tired of Zooey Mama, and so he just lets Rowley work on it full time. The thing is, it gets even weirder because near the very end of the book, Greg confronts Rowley about Zooey Mama and how he deserves to be a co-creator of it. But Rowley says Zooey Mama was his idea and that Greg had nothing to do with the creation of it. And here's the thing, time and time again, it is made a huge point that Rowley hates lying more than anything. Rowley almost never lies in the books. So you start kind of questioning yourself and you start wondering if Greg was lying about creating Zooey Mama, then what else in the books was he lying about? And I'm just going to be completely honest, we are not about to go into that rabbit hole right now, because later on, we're definitely going to be talking a lot about how Greg is definitely not a trustworthy narrator. But for right now, we're just going to move on. And now, this isn't a question that is nearly asked very often, but just more like a question I had. Everyone is constantly wondering what grade Greg is in, but what I'm wondering is, what grade is Roderick in? And now, the only thing we really know is that Roderick's age is somewhere around 16 to 17. So, obviously that does help narrow it down, but we still need to kind of guess what grade he's in. And honestly, I feel like what makes the most sense is that Roderick is in the 11th grade. And I don't know why, it just feels right to me that Roderick is in the 11th grade with Greg being in the 7th. Because, like, I've seen a bunch of Diary of a Wimpy Kid related stuff where, like, they imagine Greg and Roderick in high school together. But to me, it honestly just makes sense that by the time Greg's going into high school, it would be the time Roderick would graduate high school. And I was about to say go to college, but let's all be honest, that's not going to happen. Now, there's this one thing I want to talk about when it comes to this book, and it happens during the part of the book where Greg is part of a play. And during the play, when Greg is on stage, Manny calls him by his nickname, which is Bubby. And what's important here is what Greg says. He says that he has been keeping that name a secret for 5 years. That's kind of an issue because in Roderick Rules, Manny is stated as being 3 years old. And in the first book, it is 100% stated that Manny is the one who invented the Bubby nickname. So it's not like it's something he gained from someone else. But I'll just say this, Manny wasn't originally supposed to be 3 years old. That was a change that ended up happening. And obviously now there's just that huge continuity error in the first book. There's another thing in the Diary of Wimpy Kid books. There's this game that is constantly mentioned called Twisted Wizard. It's definitely brought up a lot in the first few books, and it's pretty much the to-go video game to be referenced when Greg is playing something. And yeah, it is just mentioned countless times throughout the books. Also, this is another small thing that happens in the first book. We see the original comic that was in the school newspaper before they started holding auditions called Wacky Dog. And pretty much what happens in the books is that Greg says it was originally funny, but then what happened was that the writer, Brian Little, started using it to deal with his personal issues, and that led to it being canceled. Another thing that's pretty small here in this book, but we should definitely mention because it's mentioned quite a bit later on, is the Worley Street Kids. The Worley Street Kids are a bunch of kids that live on obviously Worley Street, and they're pretty much the rivals of the neighborhood that Greg and Rowley live in, which is Surrey Street. And while they don't have a ton of appearances, they do have a major thing later on in the series, so it is important that I mention them here. Another thing, and don't worry, we are getting close to being done, is that there's kind of this question left in the book, which is answered by the movie, and that's pretty much Greg believes that Rowley was the one who rat him out to the safety patrol, and while we don't know for sure, we most likely can guess that it wasn't Rowley, but rather it was one of the kids who told on Greg, since we know in the movie that it was a kid that said that Greg was the one who did everything. Also, I forgot to mention this in the main plot analysis, but pretty much what Greg did to get Rowley in trouble is he just decided for the fun of it to chase a bunch of the kindergartners they were taking home with a stick that had a worm on it. So yeah, you can tell we're dealing with a genius here. And now, there's one last thing I want to talk about before we actually move on to the next book. And that is one really interesting thing that happens at the very end of the book. Pretty much at the end, when Rowley eats the cheese, Greg pretty much talks about it, saying that if anyone learned of it, Rowley's entire life would be over. So they do this interesting thing, which is never again done in the books, where they have Greg censor words. For example, in the sentence which would say they made Rowley eat the cheese, the words eat are instead gone and there's just a blank under them where the words would be. And the same thing happens in the very final sentence where Greg says, I'll just remind him that he was the guy who ate the, and obviously, where cheese is, there's nothing there. There is one thing that's kind of noble though, and that's in Roderick Rules, which I'm not going to be talking about a lot of. He kind of just says it and doesn't censor it at all, so there goes that, I guess. And wow, I've been talking about this first book for a while, so let's finally head on to the next book, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Roderick Rules. Now, before we begin talking about the book, we need to talk about new characters who were introduced in Roderick Rules. First, we have Holly, who's this girl in Greg's class who he has a major crush on. Now, she doesn't really have a large role in this book, but she's gonna have a larger role later on, so it is important that you just know that her character exists. Secondly, we have Grandpa, who's Greg's grandpa from Frank's side of the family. One thing that's notable is he doesn't have the best relationship with Frank. And lastly, we have Bill, who in this book becomes Roderick's new lead singer for Loaded Diaper. And now that we've talked about all the new characters, let's get to the main story. Part of the story starts sort of similarly to the first book, in that once again, Greg is trying to become more popular in school. But the difference here now is that Susan is trying to get Greg and Roderick to spend more time with each other, which doesn't work and leads to them arguing even more. Now, one thing you should know is that Roderick always has power over Greg since he knows a secret about Greg which happened over the summer. And throughout the book, we see all the different ways Roderick messes around with Greg. Later on, we see Roderick hold a huge party when their parents are away, and they end up both getting in trouble when later on their parents eventually realize the party happened. By the time they're no longer grounded, a local talent show is going to be starting soon, so Roderick is planning on being there, playing with his band Loaded Diaper, which my autocorrect does not like spelling. Roderick hopes that with the recording of the talent show, they can send it to a record label and become famous. This ends up not working out, and Roderick blames it on Greg. He then tells everyone he knows about what happened to Greg over the summer, which was that while at Grandpa's retirement home, Greg accidentally ran into the women's bathroom. Greg freaks out about this, but when he arrives at school, he's congratulated because as people told the story, more things changed until the story ended up being completely different. And then, at the very end, Greg, even knowing that his brother can be a jerk, helps him with his science for a project so that he won't flunk out of school. And that is the main summary of Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Roderick Rules. Now, in my opinion, this is the best Diary of a Wimpy Kid book. There are just as many memorable moments from this book as there are in the first, and I also feel that the pacing in this book is the best in the whole series, balancing the regular story structure while also still feeling like an actual journal. And like I said before about Roderick, he is easily the best character in the series, and it shows in this book. Another thing I really love is the correlation between Greg and Roderick. They're both the same in that they both want to become famous, but the way that they differ is that Roderick actually knows how he will become famous and actively tries to reach those goals. Meanwhile, you have on the other hand, Greg just expects to become famous without even knowing how he's going to become famous, and his attempts at becoming famous almost never have any chance of working out in the long run. The fact that they are so similar in concept yet different in approach, it's honestly just pure genius. And now, let's get back into the segment where I talk about a bunch of different things I noticed throughout the book. And believe me when I say, there are quite a few. The first thing I want to talk about is something that's really interesting that Roderick Rose decided to do, and that was to make sure that Greg is still a bad person, which is really interesting because you'd think at the end of the first book, now that Greg did that selfless thing with helping Rowley, he would no longer be a bad friend. But no, he still is, and it's not really like it's contradicting anything because we even see at the very end of the first book that Greg is jealous of Rowley becoming class clown. So it's clearly obvious that Greg's character development, if we were ever to properly get one, wouldn't be immediate. And that's something I just really like about this series, that characters don't just immediately change. Another thing I want to mention is something that happens early in the book. It's pretty much mentioned that during the summer, Greg was part of the swim team, and so that made me kind of interested because there's quite a couple different times across the series where Greg is mentioned as playing sports. So who knows, maybe at the end of this series, I'll do like a little segment talking about each sport Greg has played. So I just want to make note of it here. Next up is something I don't really want to talk about for too long, but it's just the thing that you can kind of notice if you're paying attention. And that's how on one page of the book, specifically pages 37 and 38, you can see a bunch of teenagers hanging out on the Heffley's front lawn. And when you see them on the next page, on page 38, you can see that with a couple of them, their clothes just changed color. So that's just kind of a weird little error there is. Another thing I want to mention is the fact that we obviously know that Greg has a ton of different journals across the series, but there's actually a couple of journals we see Greg have that aren't the main ones that we read. For example, Greg buys a Sweet Secrets diary so that he'll be able to read Rowley's because he thinks Rowley is writing about him in his. And while Greg never uses it, he still has it. And I know that there is another journal which is mentioned later on. And here's another thing that should be mentioned. A lot of the time, the timeline of Diary of Wimpy Kid is insanely inconsistent. For example, on page 77, it's mentioned how Greg, around Christmas time the year prior, was taking small bits and pieces from the gingerbread house that his mom made. But the thing is, that is never mentioned in the original book. And this happens a lot in the books, and there's not really an explanation for it. It's just things will be mentioned that clearly did not happen in the previous books, and you just kind of have to accept that. I guess it happened, but Greg didn't write about it. Anyway, let's move on to the next thing. Both Holly and Heather Hills are introduced in this book. They don't really have a major role. They're really only mentioned, but they do become more important characters later on. So obviously it's important that I mention them now. Also, this is another thing. Remember how I talked about in the first book how the calendar fit with the 2007-2008 calendar? Unfortunately, with Roderick Rules, it doesn't work like that now, and the calendar no longer fits, simply because there's just too many days in one month in one instance of the book, and it pretty much no longer fits for the rest of the series. And that's due to one main thing, and that being the fact that if you look at Roderick Rules, you realize that the book takes place across a way shorter span of time. Like the first book went from September to June, and this book only went from September to December. And that's just gonna keep going slower and slower as we keep going. The next thing I want to mention is mom bucks. Mom bucks are this thing in Roderick Rules where Greg and Roderick's mom would give them this fake currency called mom bucks, and they could exchange it for real money. And the way they got mom bucks was by spending time with each other. Now, one thing is interesting is how much one mom buck is worth. One mom buck is equivalent to 1 penny. So that means if you want $1, it would be 100 mom bucks. And we don't really know exactly how much Greg and Roderick were given, So it's hard to know really how much they would be getting from that. And one thing that's interesting from that is how later on Greg finds the board game which Mom used for the Mom Bucks at Riley's house, and he was able to get 100,000 Mom Bucks out of it, which equals $1,000. And later on, Greg has a history project which he hasn't even started, and Roderick tells Greg that he'll give him his project for 500 Mom Bucks, which would be around $5. And one thing that I always find really funny is the fact that Greg says no. He tries to do the project and he ends up not being able to. So he goes back to Roderick, and Roderick's price increases to 20,000 mom bucks, which is $200. It's honestly hilarious how large of a jump there is in money there. Obviously, they get found out, and that's the end of Mom Bucks. Here's another really minor thing, the tinfoil ball. Pretty much the story behind this is that Manny put a cookie in Greg's video game console, and so as a way to say sorry, Manny gave Greg a tinfoil ball with a bunch of different toothpicks sticking out of it, while at the same time inventing a new war crime. And Greg tries to throw it away, but Susan just doesn't let him. But then later on, Rowley ends up accidentally sitting on it, and then when Greg goes to throw it away, obviously Susan isn't trying to stop him. This next thing here is actually a pretty big storyline in Roderick Rules that goes on for a pretty large amount of time, that being the Invisible Chirag storyline. And this is basically Chirag's biggest appearance in the books, I'd say, as there isn't really as big of a moment with him as there is with the Invisible Chirag story. The Invisible Chirag joke started when Chirag was moving away, but eventually he just came back by the time the school year began, and so Greg began a joke where he acted like Chirag was still gone. And eventually it started piling up more and more and more until the whole school was in on it. And pretty much the joke just kept on going and going and going until eventually Susan was told about it and Greg had to go apologize. This thing here is just kind of sad. It's the fact that Rowley got hurt one day when he was at Greg's house, and it was entirely Greg's fault. So that meant that Greg had to audition for the talent show in place of Rowley. And he was the assistant of Rowley's friend Scotty, who's this first grader doing a magic act. And the thing that's sad is the fact that out of all the people in the talent show, they were the only people to not get in. Which, considering how many different people there must have been, is really kind of depressing. This here happens during the flashback where Greg is talking about what happened at Leisure Towers. Now, we're going to go into a little bit more detail. What happened was that Greg opened up his old diary, but then Roderick took it. But luckily, Roderick ended up tripping, and so Greg was able to take it, and then he just ran with it. And the reason he went to the bathroom was because he was going to go and destroy his diary so that Roderick wouldn't be able to get it. And we actually do see Greg start ripping out pages from the diary, and when we finally see Greg being taken out of the bathroom, we don't see him holding the diary. So we can kind of just assume that the original diary is just gone now. The last thing we'll be talking about is going to have to do with the ending, and that will be on how Greg got the Stealthinator name. What happened is that instead of people thinking that he accidentally walked into the woman's bathroom at Leisure Towers, people thought that he snuck in the girls' locker room at Crossland High School, and so all the guys gave him the name the Stealthinator. And one thing of note here that I'm probably going to be referencing a couple more times in the series, Greg mentions that it's probably going to be really hard to get someone to go to the Valentine's dance with him, considering the whole Stealthinator thing. But the thing is that it is explicitly stated multiple times that Greg's school does not have a Valentine's dance. And that the first Valentine's dance of the school doesn't happen until later on. And not only that, but the first Valentine's dance at the school happens twice. The school has its first ever Valentine's Day dance twice. I know that doesn't make any sense, but it'll make more sense when we get there. And now that's all the things I want to talk about with the second Diary of Wimpy Kid book. And now before we head to the third Diary of Wimpy Kid book, I want to have a little break where we talk about something else related to Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Then I decided, what's better than the original inspiration of Diary of a Wimpy Kid? That being none other than Igdoof. Igdoof was a comic series created by Jeff Kinney in 1989, which would be published in his college newspaper from that year until 1993. It was hugely popular at his college, and Igdoof was even referenced in a Big Nate comic. After college, Jeff Kinney tried numerous times to get Igdoof published, but it ended up never working out. Though this did luckily lead to Jeff Kinney deciding to instead write the book series we all know today. With Igdoof, you can definitely tell that this comic inspired Wimpy Kid, as you get the cynical yet light-hearted feel of the Wimpy Kid books in these comics. And another thing that's interesting about them is that two characters who are very similar in design to Greg and Manny appear a couple times in the comics. So it's really interesting seeing how many things from the comics will later become part of Diary of a Wimpy Kid. That's pretty much the gist of Igdoof. So now let's head on to the third Diary of a Wimpy Kid book, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, The Last Straw. Now, there aren't really any new characters introduced, so we can pretty much just skip straight into the plot summary. Hold on, never mind, because there is one character we should talk about, and that's Patty Farrell. You're probably wondering why, and it's because this is the last appearance of Patty Farrell in the entire series. She's just completely gone after this. So yeah, there goes Patty. And unfortunately, a lot later on in the series, a lot of other characters are going to start leaving too. The Last Straw follows Greg trying various different methods to get Holly Hills to notice him. While Greg is doing all of this, Frank is trying to get Greg to be more manly and, later on, plans on enrolling Greg into a military summer school. Things never end up working out with Holly, but something happens at the half-birthday party of Seth's Sneela. And now that I've realized it, I should quickly mention the Sneelas. They are the neighbors of the Heffleys and appear on and off again in the books. They always hold half-birthday parties for their kids and have the adults make fools of themselves so that they can send clips to a game show called America's Funniest Families. This year, Frank is going to have to go and do the same thing as all the other adults, but Greg ends up accidentally causing a huge scene right when Frank has to perform and he gets Frank out of it. This causes Frank to reconsider sending Greg to the military academy, and Greg is now free to enjoy his summer. That's the basic plot of this book, and I just want to say, the series is still going super strong, as this book is equally as great as the others, and there aren't really any complaints I have about it. Now let's get into some more detail with The Last Straw. First of all, I want to talk about a character which I forgot to mention in the character introductions, because I spend quite a bit of time making these videos, so by the time I finished recording that segment, that was quite a while back. So I decided it's probably a good idea to mention it now. And the new character that's introduced is Albert Sandy, this kid who sits at Greg's lunch table and tells a bunch of different lies. And it is important to mention him because he is going to be reoccurring a couple times throughout the series. This is another thing I want to talk about, and it's how there's this one storyline in the book where Greg and Rowley actually try to follow through on something Albert Sandy said, but then they realize that it's going to take too long. So what they instead decide to do is make a time capsule. And one idea Greg had was that he would make sure the time capsule wouldn't be open until the future when time travel is possible, and he was hoping that with the money that the person would get, because it would be worth a lot by then, that the person who got it would go back in time and give it to Greg. There are so many things wrong with that. First of all is the fact that he thinks that the money he's putting in there is going to be worth more in the future. That is definitely not going to be the case. That's going to be worth even less in the future. And also the second thing that's really dumb is the fact that Greg leaves his address for the person that finds it, even though he doesn't want it to be found until time travel is possible. So you'd think he want to put the year that the time traveler would go to give it to him. But of course, with this whole thing, Greg is just being really dumb, so it's not like he's going to start acting smart now. Something else I want to mention is the fact that Diary of a Wimpy Kid just predicts Alexa. There's this point where Greg is talking about how his grades have been slipping, and what he says is that there's not really any point in learning all that stuff because in the future, and I'm quoting this straight from the book, everyone is going to have a personal robot that tells you whatever you need to know. Alexa didn't exist until 2014. Siri didn't exist until 2011. This was made in 2009. And not made, this was published in 2009. This existed even before that. So yeah, Diary of Wimpy Kid just, casually predicting the future, as one does. Here's when I want to bring back up the Valentine's Day inconsistency, and I am actually going to be bringing it up again too. During the book, the school is going to be holding a Valentine's Day dance, and they specifically state that the school had never had one before. And they're talking about it as if the school had just decided to do it. But the thing is, in Roderick Rules, Greg mentions the Valentine's Day dance. You could easily just chalk this up to, oh, Roderick Rules takes place in the same school year, so possibly they already planned this ahead of time. And yeah, that is a fair point, but there is something which is going to happen later on, specifically the 7th book, that's just going to completely mess things up. Here's another thing, and it's about the word Ploopy. This is a storyline in the book, which is kind of minor, where Manny gets really upset because Frank threw out his favorite blanket, Tingy, thinking that it was garbage, because Tingy is barely holding on to dear life. That thing is in shambles with how long Manny has had it. And so Manny's just really upset in general, and Manny calls Greg that word. It's like Greg thinks it's a little kid's swear word, so he asks his mom about it, but she doesn't know anything about it. And then what ends up happening later on is that Greg says the word to Manny during church, and he just freaks out and can't be stopped, and they have to leave. And so the word is just completely banned from the Heffley house. Although we do see a little bit later on that Roderick just finds a way around it. Another thing that's really interesting is something which I mentioned before in the first book, but I want to mention again here because in this case it's a little bit different. In the first book, I talked about how there is a different font in one moment, but thing is, I wasn't 100% sure. In this case, I am 100% sure that they have a different font in this moment. And it's on page 134. Pretty much there's this whole storyline where Frank makes Greg play football, and pretty much Greg gets in trouble for something someone else did. I'll just read you the part of the sentence that's important. It says, "It looked like I was the one who honked the horn." And what's really interesting is the fact that the I is actually bolded and underlined. And that's just something that we don't see in the entire rest of the series. So it's really interesting that we just see that in that single moment. This is another thing that you should know just for later. And that's the fact that we're introducing these characters called the Woodley brothers. This all begins when Greg joins the Boy Scouts so that he can try to convince Frank to not make him go to Spag Union. And what happens is that during a trip, Greg and Frank are going to go, but Greg isn't able to because he's sick. And Frank signed up as a chaperone, so he had to go without Greg. And Frank had to take care of the Woodley brothers. And what ends up happening is this whole mess where the two of them start fighting. And it just ends with Frank being even more upset with Greg than before. And the thing is, that's not really an important storyline. They're not even really important characters. It's just important that we mention them for a future book where they actually do come back. Because if I just mention those characters again without mentioning any time before, and I just expect people to be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this, that's just dumb. So it's important, obviously, that I just mention these characters here so that I remember them later on. We're nearing the end now, and I want to talk about this really interesting thing that's just never brought up again in the entire series. And that's the fact that Greg wears contacts. We learned this on the day Greg goes to the roller skating rink to try to talk to Holly, and Greg says how he lost one of his contact lenses. And it actually turns out that Greg's eyesight is really bad without his contacts. And he has to wear these super thick glasses to be able to see. That's just really interesting because it is never brought up again in the entire series. There's not a single mention of it. And you would think that something like that would come around again, but it just never does. And now this is the last thing I want to talk about. And it's interesting because this is the first time this is done the whole series. And while it is on a smaller scale, I feel like it's important to mention it here so that you know that later on that wasn't the first time. This is the first instance where it happens. It's where the end of The Last Straw connects directly to Dog Days. What ends up happening is that Greg and Rowley meet this girl named Trista, and Greg realizes that Rowley can take the two of them to this country club that he's a part of, and Greg's hoping that he can do this so he can spend more time with her. And that leads directly into Dog Days, where we see what happens almost directly after that. And that's really interesting because that's the first time the series does it, and it is going to be done a couple more times. Anyway, that's all for The Last Straw. Now we're going to be moving on to the final book of this video, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Dog Days. Now, while there aren't any characters which are introduced in this book, there is one character who's going to be leaving the series here, and that's Holly Hills, who really doesn't have a lot of time in the books. She has minor appearances in both this book and Roderick Rules, and she's a major character in The Last Straw, but that's really it. So this is unfortunately the last time we're going to be seeing her in the books. And that's really it with characters, so let's head on to the plot analysis. In Dog Days, for the first time, we get to see Greg during the summer. Greg just wants to spend the whole time home playing video games, but Susan wants Greg to spend his summer outdoors. And throughout the course of the book, we see Greg going outside and trying things during the summer, and we just see how everything he does ends up going wrong because of the various things he does. And another notable thing during the book is that Frank gets the family a dog which is named Sweetie. By the end of the summer, everything has gone wrong as Sweetie was given to Grandma, and Greg, thinking Frank was giving Greg away, ends up causing issues which makes Frank super upset with him. And not only that, but there's tons of fights between Greg and Rowley over this summer, with first the lawn service they made, the different stuff that happened when they both went to the boardwalk, and in the end, the video game tournament they compete in which Rowley beats Greg. And with all this going on, it eventually culminates to them just no longer being friends, which actually leads into the next book. But before we get into that, let's talk about the various things I noticed in Dog Days. Firstly, this is a pretty big aspect of the book, and it's the Muddy Hand storyline. The Muddy Hand is the main antagonist in this horror movie that Greg and Rowley watches called Hello, You're Dead. And what ends up happening is that Greg ends up being terrified of the Muddy Hand across the entire rest of the book. And the reason that Riley even beats Greg in the tournament later on is because Rowley accidentally smashed Greg's hand with a hammer, thinking that Greg was the Muddy Hand. So the Muddy Hand is a pretty important aspect of this book. Another thing I want to mention now is just something I was wondering about, and that was, has Greg committed any crimes across these books? And the answer to that, I know, is most definitely yes, especially as we get later on in the series. But I just wanted to list this here now so that possibly later on we talk about it again and try to see all the different crimes Greg commits across the series. So yeah, definitely around the end of this series, we will be trying to go through all the different crimes Greg committed in the books. This is another thing which is introduced in this book that actually comes back around a couple times in the series, and that is Greg's Ladybug phone. This phone is used a couple times in the books, and Greg gets it on his birthday, where he's expecting real fulfillments of getting the Ladybug, which can only call home and 911. So obviously for Greg, it's just completely worthless, except it does come back around later on in the book. Like I said before, Frank was super upset because of something Greg did, and what Greg did was, because Greg thought that Frank was going to sell him, he called 911 on Frank. I just felt that it was important to mention the Ladybug because it has a ton of appearances across the series. There's this other thing that happens in the book that's kind of not great, and that's the fact that Greg's mom is indirectly responsible for the death of Greg's pet fish. And I'll explain it. When Greg's birthday ends up being messed up, what Frank and Susan decide to do is let Greg go to a pet store to buy a pet. And so Greg ends up buying a fish. And they bring along Roderick and Manny also, and Roderick himself also gets a fish. And now Roderick gets a fish, which is specifically stated as being very dangerous. And it's also very clear later on that Roderick does not feed it. And so there's one day where the Heffleys go to a water park, and what Susan did is that when she saw how bad Roderick's fish bowl was, she put Roderick's fish in the same bowl as Greg's. And so, of course, when they came back, Roderick's fish was there, but Greg's wasn't. And hey, why not? Let's make a 2-for-1 deal. Greg's grandpa ran over Frank's dog. There's really not much to it. Greg's grandpa just casually mentions that to Frank, and Frank gets super upset about it. But this is really important because it does lead to Frank getting Sweetie. This other thing is related to a very common misconception, and that's the fact that people think Roderick is stupid. But throughout the course of the early books, it is clearly shown that he is not dumb. It's just that he pretends to be dumb so that people expect less from him. But then a lot of people wonder, then why is Roderick just terrible at spelling? This is shown at one point in the book, where Roderick goes to get a bowl with Sweetie's name on it. And when Roderick comes back, he spells it sweaty. And now before you go thinking that Roderick is really dumb, the truth is actually just really simple. Roderick has dyslexia. If you don't know, dyslexia is a condition that makes it very difficult to read and spell fluently. That would pretty much perfectly explain why Roderick is so smart with everything else, but he just isn't great at spelling. Another thing I want to talk about, and this is also another concurring storyline in the book, and that's the story with the Cranium Shaker. The Cranium Shaker is this ride at the boardwalk, which Greg really wants to go on, and this is because Roderick told him that he couldn't call himself a man until he rode the Cranium Shaker. And the whole reason Greg even goes with the Jeffersons to the boardwalk is so that he can go on the Cranium Shaker. And what ends up happening is Greg gets really messed up by the ride, pretty much saying it's the most nauseating experience he's had in his whole life. And one thing I recently found out is that the Cranium Shaker is actually based on a real ride called the Zipper. You can probably find some interesting stuff on YouTube. I'll show a picture of it right now, but yeah, it's very clear that the Cranium Shaker was inspired off of this. Another thing that's mentioned a couple times in this book is the Little Cutie comic. This was mentioned in the first book, so I probably should have mentioned it there, but it is more prominent in this book. Little Cutie is this short one-panel comic series which Greg and Frank just hate with every fiber of their being. And in the books, it's known as really the only thing which Greg and Frank can both agree on, and that's that the Little Cutie comics are horrible. And there is a minor storyline in Dog Days where they find out that the final Little Cutie comic is going to come out, so the two of them start counting down the days before the final Little Cutie comic releases so that they can celebrate. But since luck isn't on their side, the Little Cutie comic gets recontinued. And this is the second to last thing I'll be talking about, and that's how this book, similarly to The Last Straw, connects directly to the next book, The Ugly Truth, but I definitely feel like it does it in a bigger way compared to The Last Straw to Dog Days. Because the events of this book directly lead into the storyline of the next book, unlike the previous instance, where we just see what happens directly after the end of the previous book. And this is the last thing I want to talk about, and it's actually something that I got wrong. I originally believed that this was the end of the online version of the Diary of Wimpy Kid books, and okay, I'm going to be talking about those very soon. In fact, I'm going to be talking about them in this video. All you need to know right now is that there was an original online version of Diary of a Wimpy Kid. And what I believed was that the first 4 books were the only books which had pieces from the online version in them. But that's actually wrong. It was the first 8 books. And you know what? We're done with talking about dog days right now. Let's just talk about the online version of Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Because there's quite a bit to unpack. And now, while I am saying that, I'm not going to be talking about the whole thing because I honestly feel like that's worthy of its own video. So now let's do our final break and let's talk about the online version of Diary of a Wimpy Kid. The online version of Diary of a Wimpy Kid was created in 2004 and was consistently updated until 2005. It was mainly a mashup of the first 3 journals while also containing moments that happened during the first 8 books, and there's even stuff from Diary of an Awesome Friendly Kid that's found here. The book is huge, spanning over 1,200 pages. The story follows Greg in the 7th grade of middle school. Yes, it is confirmed here that Greg is in the 7th grade. And when it comes to the story, it basically is the plots of the first 3 books if they happen across the span of 1 year. We see Greg trying to get more popular in middle school, which leads to his relationship with Rowley worsening. We see Greg and Roderick always arguing, with Roderick having the upper hand by knowing Greg's secret. And we see Frank trying to get Greg to be more active, which leads to Frank threatening to send Greg to military school. The thing that is the most fascinating about this book is the fact that the tone of it feels similar to the books that were released, obviously, but the online version is a bit more mature. It's clear that Jeff Kinney imagined this series as being for a more mature audience, but either he changed his mind or his publishers recommended making the books more kid-friendly, so then we ended up with the version we have now. That's not to say that the books we got are worse than the online version. I feel like they both have their upsides and downsides to the different tones, and honestly, it's just cool that we even have access to this version of the Diary of a Wimpy Kid books. I would definitely recommend reading this version of the book if you want to see Diary of a Wimpy Kid in a way that's not really seen anywhere else. Although the original website that hosted it, Funbrain, took down the book, but if you go on the fanmade Diary of a Wimpy Kid wiki, you can find a link to the archive version, which still has the book in its entirety. So, if you ever have the time, you should go check it out. And now, we have finally reached the end of this era of Diary of a Wimpy Kid. So I just want to talk about my opinions on this part of the series. This is easily the peak of Diary of a Wimpy Kid, as it has the most memorable parts of the entire series, and while the stories are simple, they are great as they're both super well executed, and a lot of the stories can be relatable to a lot of people. I love the fact that Greg here is such a selfish person in these early books and doesn't instantly change, because if Greg were to change and become a better person, it wouldn't be immediate. A lot of time would have to pass if Greg were to develop and become more selfless. I feel that out of the entirety of the series, this is the most cohesive era of the books, as there is almost always countless moments of continuity in the first 4 books, as we explained when talking about the online version. I fully believe that these 4 books should be read by anyone, as they're not just good kids books, they're just great literature in general. Now, this is going to be where we're ending the video. I hope you all enjoyed. Be ready for part 2, which will be coming soon, and I'll see you all in the next one.